Hello, and welcome to the Branching PathCast. I'm Marley, and today we're going to map the relationship between algorithms and relational modeling. Here is stick around. Dijkstra's algorithm is one of the more well-known among pathfinding algorithms. For reasons unknown, I found myself repeatedly implementing pathing algorithms throughout the time I have been a programmer. When experimenting with a new engine or language, the creation of a basic graph system that supports some kind of searching functionality is usually one of the things I like to begin with. Perhaps it is the way that I visualize things, or my inclination towards the creation of two-dimensional planes as an optimal restricted space for my designs. I've found that restrictions usually fuel creativity and progress, as in the creation of music. Having artificial limitations that graduate the continuous possibility space makes it more wieldy, and strategy and creativity spawn from the surmounting of obstacles. This is why programming and design are so enjoyable in themselves. The overcoming of chosen obstacles for no other reason than the process itself. This is a reflection of games. Since this particular thing is something that I frequently explore, I'm usually drawn into roguelike algorithms, as a large part of their engine concerns the efficient and creative navigation of 2D grids. Although this is my usual gateway into pathing algorithms and graph structuring, the usefulness of graphs and the efficient sorting and pathing of graphical structures has innumerable applications in software, and there has long been efforts to tweak and improve the handling and navigation of paths. So graphs all have basic components that make them up. Nodes that form the points of the graph, and edges that communicate the connectivity between different nodes. In a simple graph depicting 2D space, you can easily imagine an open floor represented by this structure. If you were to picture a grid, each space may be represented by a node, and each node connected to an edge in which the directionality is not restricted. In this way, we build an algorithm that takes as input the current and target node and then calculates a pathway from one to the other if possible. This is generally done with the goal of getting the shortest path possible. In a simple graph, two methods commonly used are depth-first search and breadth-first search. They both have to do with the constant visitation of nodes not visited, taking unvisited neighboring nodes and tracking the directionality of how they were visited. If the target is reached from the starting node, the path can be derived from tracing backwards from the target node to the node that it came from, until the pathway reaches the start. The methods mentioned before, depth-first and breadth-first, have their differences as you would expect, one prioritizing searching wider and the other in a deeper fashion. Although there can be an educated guess as to which algorithm would have more optimal outcome given two coordinates in a grid structure, it isn't really known which would be preferable. This becomes less predictable still as graphical structures increasingly decouple from their representation of concrete things. With the current efficacy of computers in the modern day, the difference is likely not meaningful enough for the implementation and preferential use of one of these algorithms over the other given the closeness of 2 points in a grid. But this will get spicy, I promise you. So you can do a limited amount of things with this kind of graph. If there's a wall, you can represent the impassability of that wall by disconnecting the edges of that node from the neighboring nodes, making it impassable by the pathing algorithm. If you want to implement differences that are more nuanced, such as having pathways that are easier to traverse, then you can give edges between nodes weight, allowing for certain kinds of terrain to be more favorable than others in the algorithm. Dijkstra's algorithm is best visualized as a liquid, flowing outward to the next closest point that is the easiest place to go from all previously visited points. In this way, it finds the shortest path from one point to another given their weighted edges, so it operates as a kind of breadth-first search for weighted graphs. The eloquent solution and versatility of Dijkstra's maps using Dijkstra's shortest path algorithm is a stepping stone, and it is one of my favorite algorithms due to how powerful and slick it is. This is the algorithm version of everything everywhere all at once. All of the heavy processing is done ahead of time, with unique maps being generated for specific goals. There's a great article from the site RogueBasin that I will link. I advise you to check it out if you are interested. So if you want to automatically path to the next unvisited destination, for instance, then you can set visited paths to have an extremely high weight and then calculate at the beginning the minimum number of steps from the character to any given point in space. This is calculated by checking values compared to all neighboring nodes and adjusting the weight accordingly. I'm sure this isn't doing the algorithm justice, but I assure you that listening to me describe this more in depth would not be fruitful or pleasant. There are articles and visualizations that make plain what is perhaps more difficult to imagine here. But the end result of the pre-processing and creation of this map is that from then on, the otherwise fairly complex task of taking the optimal next step towards an unvisited location becomes suddenly trivial as the running of water down a slope. All that must be done is follow the gradients formed by the map, performing maintenance every step that is taken. This upkeep is much slighter a task than the recalculation between 2 points, and so the work done up front is really worth it depending on the kind of thing that is being worked on. But that is one of the most mundane use cases for this kind of thing. Dijkstra's maps have many more uses, some of which are stated in the aforementioned link. By playing with the weights of the maps in different ways, such as inversing weights and altering goals, numerous other things may be accomplished. Other examples given are entities that flee or approach a being, or type of being, the rendering of light sources diminishing illumination, entities that are drawn to or repulsed from certain things. Maps can be combined in order to create combinatorial Dijkstra's maps, with their weights being themselves weighted based on the current state of the thing accessing the map. So, for instance, if there is a creature that has a need to flee danger, seek food, and is not thirsty, these things can affect the relative maps with varying degrees. Then those maps may be efficiently overlaid in a sense, and the decision becomes trivial. At the same time, fairly realistic behavioral patterns may emerge without great processing costs, but the modulated multiplicative matrices deriving behavior across graduated moments allows for engaging and impressive results for generally trivial processing. This is all visited in greater depth by others who are wiser than I. I don't believe I'm capable of conveying how radical this algorithm is, and I love it. And where my mind has been going, it seems to be the case for most things, is the polar opposite ends. I've previously talked about the utility and gains from keeping things simple and clean. In many cases, the simplicity of the solution, even if it may lean towards pure randomness, is something experienced as providing seemingly more realistic behavior from entities compared to sophisticated neuronal networks. Simple, weighted stochastic state machines often perform as well or better than their complex counterparts, especially factoring in the generation and maintenance cost of neuronal webs. At the same time, I can't help but be enamored by the idea that an alternative, eloquent, and meaningful behavioral system to modulate entity behavior is going to best a simplistic state model when done right. Thus, prepare for me to once again indulge in the forbidden act of hypocrisy and disappoint you. So, microbial life is competitive, insofar as cells may come together and aid one another, as can be seen from the signals being secreted and taken in that revolve around the signaling of degrees of separation. They are also used to modulate localized aggression. Although the situation is complicated in multicellular organisms, there remains a never-ending process of cooperation and competition between diversified cells that make up the organism and the cohabitant microorganisms that use it as an ecosystem. There have been many studies that show a ratio of the population of microorganisms to human cells in an individual comes out in favor of the former. There has been a focus of attention lately on gastrointestinal microbiota, as the impacts of the gut-brain axis overall impact on health is being further appreciated. This in relation to the systemic impacts of inflammation and cortisol, or the stomach being heavily sensitive to serotogenic signaling, for instance. And as existence is perpetually fuzzy rather than abiding by rules, there are examples of things like cell apoptosis, the programmed cell death in order to replace older or malfunctioning cells with new ones, or even during the formation of organisms as they develop and grow. But one of the striking things about the behavior of neurons is their seemingly competitive nature. The development of the mind across the first few decades has many phases of development that impact more evolutionarily ancient and then increasingly recent brain regions in their increasing rigidity. Although neuronal plasticity continues throughout life, developmental phases are punctuated by periods of rapid neuronal innervation and intense neuronal pruning. In other words, periods of increasing association and periods of increasing dissociation of neurons. The neurons across regions come in different flavors, and these neurons continue to modulate and alter their behavior and that of others based on a complex interaction of different factors related to input and output in the moment and across time, and in accordance with their external and internal receptors. Most neurons are scrappy, and in a way they can be understood as vying for position. It's a tragedy of the commons in a sense, and neurons are competing for real estate. In the event that there is damage suffered to a set of neurons, for instance, and those neurons perish or become uncooperative with the system, then the surrounding neurons will look to take advantage of the opportunity and make connections with others to subvert or circumvent the inoperable region. This can be seen in certain kinds of sensory loss, for instance, where there stops being a kind of sensory signal fed into the related brain region. The lack of signal will cause the gradual degradation of those cells. This leaves an opportunity for the overtaking of that region by other sensory neurons, thus allowing for the strengthening of that mode of sensory processing in lieu of the lost or diminished sense. As regions of the brain are specialized towards certain operations in service of the organism as a whole, and the experience that most are familiar with is a highly processed and perceptively seamless one, it can be easy to fall into the framing that the brain is somewhat unfragmented and functions somewhat like an engine. If there is loss of a portion of the engine, then the function ceases. But for instance, such as the performing of a corpus callosotomy, the severing of the corpus callosum in patients that have otherwise intractable epileptic seizures, this leaves the two hemispheres of the brain practically functioning in isolation from one another. Although there may be less significant transmission of information via extremely circuitous routes, the overall ability to process what is occurring in a given moment is greatly reduced. Because of the way in which things are wired, you can take steps to isolate and communicate information to only the left or right hemisphere, as most of the information, the sensory information that is directed from the left hemisphere, is from the right sensory pathways, for instance. Experimentation has been done to suggest that, in this instance, subject matter may be presented to one hemisphere that will cause a response, such as disgust, which ripples through the system. This change would be perceived by the second hemisphere, and as it is possible to ask the hemispheres separately what the reason of the response is, you are given two different answers, one derived from the experiential data, and one confabulated based on a lack of the actual reason. But an answer will be generated, and more specialized things, such as complex verbalization, will be relegated to only one hemisphere. There have been discussions about the robustness of the experiments. However, it seems clear to me that there's an important information exemplifying something fundamental about organismic operation. This is further bolstered by how systems may ebb and flow in the processing of things in a given moment. The conscious experience is highly processed, such as the experience with the perception of things visually. There's a cluster at the center of your eye where you take in no information, and the mind seamlessly overwrites it in real time, as if there's no blind spot. The limited awareness that people have is another good example, whereby there are various videos of people tasked with monitoring something, only to slip something else by that should stand out but doesn't. Nobody understands the frailty of perception, processing, and attention like psychologists, magicians, and scammers. And as neuroscience continues to progress, we continue to learn things, such as the surprising degree of innervation of visual processing by non-visual neuronal regions, which hint at the degree of manipulation of sensory fields alongside the gathering of external input. These regions act not in isolation, but have in a sense their own understanding. The specialized neuronal function takes as input certain information, then that information is processed in a particular way. In response, that information is output in a meaningful way. Through this process, it can be understood that in some sense, discrete regions focus on certain kinds of input, weight certain kinds of things differently, and output what seems most relevant based on the operational context. If the information in visual fields undergoes filtering in a way that resolution is consolidated to take up less memory to display a picture, things are continually prioritized, deprioritized, and so fragments of information are being shared between regions who also have a subset of information. So there are regions that are throttling some systems and engaging others when there is a fear response, for instance. and that empowers some brain regions while diminishing the signal of others alongside the regulation of the nervous response. So while there are many ways in which the visual processing is impacted in a sense, the region responsible for the processing of that information is in a way removed from the process compared to the experience of it. The highly innervated regions that operate as consolidation points, where the otherwise fairly isolated regional processing are weighed and blended into a cohesive experience that is more actionable and manageable, allows for an otherwise competing system to act coherently. As there are regions that become specialized to a meaningful degree to focus in on more specific inputs and outputs, it becomes something more like a diverse orchestra where different instruments play a different part, serve a different purpose, and act in a different timing. But in the end, the time and dissonance breaks in favor of a concerted experience as the group falls in line with the conductor, although the actual members are cacophonous prior to their production and final mixed product that the audience experiences. I think I've been delving into this enough for the moment, but all of this exploration on a perspective in which cognition and experiences may be understood as my inspiration for the modeling of entities via Dijkstra's mapping, as neuronal regions may be envisioned as pursuing distinct goals, having distinct perceptive inputs, and having a unique subset of external effectors. I have been interested in the exploration of the representation of entities' internal environments as Dijkstra's maps. The minds of these entities may be constructed with different regions having different properties and layouts, resources, and inhabitants. The regions are impacted by various things, such that they may vie for control, gaining and losing territory. These regions have associated motivational compulsion, affecting the entity behavior based on the current circumstance. The different entities that act as extensive forces may operate as arbiters of their regions, bolstering or aggravating other regions and their inhabitants, or fighting for resources or zones of control. The external events of the being are translated into buffs and debuffs and shifting the dynamic and motivational weight of the internal system. This system in turn is what dictates the next move that is translated into external behavior or goal seeking by the entity in which this is taking place. This kind of system may be messy and strange to implement, but there are lots of aspects to it that I have left fuzzy and abstract. The differentiation between the visual regions representation, the modular regions, and how the integration regions would operate, the exact functions that serve to translate external experience to internal effect, and vice versa. And this may be one of those systems I've been wary of, as the complicated nature of designing and running this may not be worth the cost compared to a state machine. At the end of the day, is the player experience going to be different? Will it be appreciated? And would it be an interesting event if it was readily accessible to observe during gameplay? There are so many things that I feel would be cool in implementing this kind of system specifically for player and rival characters in a game that is more about emergent storytelling. It would be really interesting to procedurally generate different ways in which the mental representation of entities may be initially constructed, have different boundaries for various parameters, and see how things translate. And I suppose the idea of manifesting different effects such as poisoning, confusion, or the playing out of inception or information retrieval, the impact on experience, and the reflection of habitual behavior on the plastic representation. I think there's a lot of interesting things ripe to explore, and I'll probably look at creating something like this in the future. It seems like a really compelling prototype, if nothing else. Well, I'm Marley, and this has been the Branching PathCast. I hope that this strange exploration into the colliding algorithms and neurophysiology has been entertaining. Do you agree or disagree with anything? Have any thoughts? Please feel free to leave a comment and check out branchingpath.com, where this podcast lives, alongside blogs, and who knows what else in the future. Well, have you subscribed? Is this the Dijkstra that broke the camel's back? Hopefully, I'll catch you next time. Bye!